Alright, in this video we're going to learn about domain and range. Hopefully some of you have heard these terms and know that domain is the set of all the x values and the range is the set of all the y values. So by the end of Wednesday you guys should be able to look at graphs, tables, and functions and be able to tell me what the domain of the function is and what the range of the function is. So we're going to use set notation and interval notation to refer to the domain and range of functions. For set notation, use curly brackets, and interval notation, use parentheses and brackets. Parentheses are used when a point is not included or you see an open circle on a graph, and brackets are going to be used when a point is included, so you'll see a closed-in circle. Alright, so let's just look at an example of 3 coordinate points. You're given coordinates 1, 6, 3, 8, and 5, 3. So these are just 3 random points on a graph. So the domain is just the set of all the x values. So here we're using set notation, and the set is 1, 3, and 5 because those are the x values in the set. And the range is 3, 6, and 8, which is just the list of all the y coordinates in that set. So take a second and pause the video and tell me the domain and range of the second example, given coordinates -5, 4, 6, 1, and 3, -10. So just write that down and play the video to see if you get it right. So you should have gotten that the domain is -5, 3, and 6, and the range of that function is -10, 1, and 4. So sometimes it isn't possible to list all the values that x or y of x and y because the graph is continuous, which means that it goes on forever and ever, which means that you're going to have points that you can't really write down. You'll have 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and all those points in between. So we're not going to list all that out. It's going to be made up of an infinite number of points. For example, a line, array, and even a segment. So in a continuous graph, to determine the domain, you should focus on looking left to right of the graph. And to determine the range, you should focus on looking bottom to top. So write that down and remember that. Left to right is the domain and bottom to top is the range. Okay, so let's look at this example. We have a closed-in circle at -7, -3. And then we have an open circle at 5, 1. And this is a segment. So open circle means non-inclusive, so we use parentheses when we're going to use our interval notation, and closed circle means that it includes that point, so we're going to use brackets. So the domain of this function, looking left to right, you go from -7 all the way to 5, but 5 is not included, so it's -7 is less than or equal to x is less than 5. That's set notation. In the interval notation, you just put a bracket, -7, 5. Again, your x value starts at -7. That's the very left point. And then you follow the graph until you get to 5. And 5 is not included. And it's going to include all those x values in between. Okay, for the range, you're going to go from bottom to top. So the very least point on the y-axis or the y-interval is -3, and that point is included. So -3 is less than or equal to y is less than 1. It goes all the way up to 1, and that point is not included again. So that's how you write it in set notation. In interval notation, you include the bracket for -3, 1, parentheses. So note this important note at the bottom. To find the domain for a graph with 2 endpoints, always identify the x values of the point farthest to the left and the point farthest to the right. So just take your pencil and follow it and see how far you go left and how far you go right. And for the range, you want the y values of the lowest point and the highest point. Okay, let's look at another example. This is an example of a continuous graph with only one endpoint, so it's continuous forever in the other direction. So it starts at this point at 0, 0 and continues all the way to infinity. It's going to keep going and going and going. So the domain, looking at the x values, the furthest left point is x is equal to 0. So x is greater than or equal to 0 because it goes from 0 to infinity. So that is how you would write it in interval notation with bracket around the 0, and always use parentheses for infinity because it's not a finite point. And the range, you have to see what the lowest point on the y's are. So the lowest point is 0 again, and the highest point, this will go all the way up to infinity again. So y is greater than or equal to 0, and in interval notation, it's 0 to infinity with a 0, with a bracket around the 0, and a parenthesis around the infinity. So just note, if the arrow were pointing to the left, if it were going from 0 to negative infinity, the domain would be less than or equal to the x value. And then if the arrow were pointing down, the range would be less than or equal to the y value. So just note that. Okay, let me see if you guys can do this example on your own. This is an example of a continuous graph that has two arrows. So take a second, pause the video, and just see if you can come up with the domain and range of this function. Okay, hopefully you notice that the domain, there are two arrows. So this arrow goes all the way to negative infinity, and this right arrow goes all the way to positive infinity. So if you follow left to right, it's going to touch all the real values, all the real numbers. So to write that, you just write negative infinity to infinity. And the range, so going bottom to top, your lowest point on your graph is at 0, 0, 0 at the origin. So you write that as y is greater than or equal to 0 because, again, these arrows tell you that this is going to go up all the way to infinity. In the interval notation, you have a 0 around the bracket and a parenthesis around the infinity. So if one of the arrows were pointing up and one of the arrows were pointing down, then the range would be all real numbers. So if one of these went up and one went down, then you would cover all of the numbers on the graph. But in this case, it starts at the origin, so we have 0 to infinity. Okay, so what I want you to do for homework and bring to me on Wednesday is I want you to determine the domain and range of these two functions. So do that for homework and bring that into me. And also write down 3 questions that you still have about domain and range.